Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome. This is the 7th program Life Science Alley has put on since the beginning of 2010 on this particular subject, on the 510K issue. And this is the latest update. I want to thank our speaker, Ralph Hall, who's been an integral part of what we've been doing all along. But at this point, I want you to hear from our CEO, the CEO of Life Science Alley and the BioBusiness Alliance of Minnesota in our strategic affiliation, Dale Wallstrom. Dale?
Thank you, Larry, and good morning and welcome, everybody. I will make my comments very short, very brief. I'm not going to go into the strategic affiliation today. We've talked about that before, and if any of you weren't in any of those other sessions and you have any questions, let me know. But my primary purpose here today is to introduce an individual who I will introduce in a moment, but to let you know that as an organization, we are making a very concerted effort to try to shift out even more into a more leading role in trying to help to understand how our industry and our community can play in a more effective way in trying to help guide some of the regulatory issues that are shaping and in many cases impeding our industry. Again, I won't go into details today. Another time we can. But we have a lot of data that we've collected over the last 6 months, last 9 months. It shows the impact that the regulatory environment has had on the industry in total, not just locally here, but also at a national level, that are quantitative, where we can demonstrate movement in many cases, out of the country because of the environment. So we're deeply ingrained in this whole issue, and as a result of that, we have made a strategic decision at the board level, and that is to invest more heavily in trying to get a leadership mechanism intact. So I'm going to introduce a guy by the name of Shay Mandel. Shay is our new Vice President of Government and Affiliation Relations. Shay is chartered has a long history in this area of leading other organizations in other states, long history down in Washington, D.C., working directly with legislators and the like. And Shay is now chartered with helping us to put together a longer-term strategy and mechanism for interacting in a more effective manner, even more effective manner. We're trying to shape policy at the national and international level. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shay.
Good morning, everybody. Dale, thank you. And this is really my first opportunity to be in front of all of you, and in fact, in front of a large audience of members. Really appreciate everybody attending the program today, and I want to be brief as well because what Ralph has to say is what you're all here for today. A couple of things. I am the new Vice President for Government and Affiliate Relations, and as Dale mentioned, we're going to be very active in creating proactive, solutions-based public policy agendas, both at the state and federal level. We'll be soliciting you and your organizations to participate in that. So my objective is to really sort of play the shepherd in terms of putting together agendas that are really driven by you, by our members, touching on the various sectors that our organization represents. I want to leave you with a couple of things today. If you are not aware, at the beginning of this month on August 1st and 2nd, the CDRH leadership from the FDA came to Minnesota for a couple of days. Dr. Shurin, Dr. Maisel, and a team of the senior leadership came, and that was at the invitation of Dale, who had some conversations with Jeff and other folks at FDA, and really began the conversation around what you're hearing in terms of a buzzword, regulatory science. And our intent in bringing the FDA out was not to, at that point, argue about the IOM report or the 510K process, and this was in advance of the IOM report release, but rather to have a dialogue, sort of scientist to scientist, to expose them to really what you all do on a day-to-day basis, give them an education about the quality of modeling and advanced testing methodologies that we use in industry in order to deliver products that are innovative and that are safe. And so our intent was to engage them around that conversation because we felt like they really didn't have a perfect understanding of what we do on a regular day-to-day basis. Over the course of that couple days, there were a lot of takeaways. We closed the day with the town hall meeting where a lot of questions were posed, and of course those questions did tend to gravitate back towards some of the issues that we'll talk about today. But there's some key takeaways from that meeting and some challenges that I want to pose to all of you today to think about, and what we're really looking for is your engagement. First and foremost, the FDA is putting on a workshop on the use of computer modeling in terms of device submissions That conference and workshop is September 7th through the 9th. You'll see on your way out flyers with that information if you don't already have it, and we would encourage you certainly to take a look at that and consider attending. If you are considering attending, please give myself or Dale a call. One of the things we've been communicating with the FDA, we want to sort of let them know, all the folks from Minnesota that are attending. And what we'd like to do after that conference is, for those of you that are attending, is to explore putting together another program like this where we might be able to feature your feedback in terms of what's really happening at the FDA, what their focus is in terms of that workshop, and where this concept of regulatory science is really heading, so that we're prepared as an industry to really deal with those issues and react and hopefully drive some of the definitions of what regulatory science is going forward. Second thing that came out of that, the lab director for CDRH, actually for the device industry, Joel Michaelbust, was out and invited us to come out. So we're in the process of putting together as large of a contingent as we can of folks like yourselves to go out and visit the lab and see what they're working on. So again, if you're interested in that, please contact me. And we'd love to take 20, 30, 40, 50 people out there, depending on the numbers. We may have a full day, maybe 2 days of a lab tour, and really gain some insights into what the FDA views as important technical issues and what they're doing in their laboratory. And then finally, I would say the biggest announcement and the biggest takeaway is that Dale and Dr. Shuren agreed to put together a public-private partnership. And this is something that the FDA is involved in, mostly on the pharma side, but there is no mechanism today where we all can engage them and really attempt to influence these issues, gain greater understanding, try to move forward in moving the unpredictability issue down a bit. And so this public-private partnership, which is still, we're still crossing T's and dotting I's, but again, looking for your engagement to drive that. And we're very excited about the prospect of being engaged with the FDA in ways that industry hasn't necessarily been before, and taking the lead from here in Minnesota. And we're going to be partnering strongly with the University of Minnesota to make that happen. So there's a few key items that I'd ask you to think about. Certainly you can find me on our website, email me with any questions, thoughts, concerns, or interests that you have, and I look forward to hearing that from you and keeping you updated on what we're doing to try and improve industry's position with the FDA and CDRH. So with that, let's talk about the IOM report, draft guidance. I'm not even going to introduce Ralph Hall because I think he needs no introduction. Dr. Hall has been the person I've certainly spent the most time with since I came to Life Science Alley. And he's going to walk us through today everything that you could possibly ever want or need to know about the IOM report and the 510K draft guidance that's out today. Ralph Hall.
I'm going to start with bad news. As most of you know, I teach at the University Law School here. My watch is broken, so I have no idea how much time I'm going to take. So that's always dangerous. I can't remember a time when there has been more activity in the guidance area and the general submission area than we have going on right now. Purpose here really is three things. First of all, to give you at least what I think are the current key CDRH initiatives so you can start thinking about proactive regulatory strategies so you can get ahead of the curve as you're thinking about what you're going to be doing in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. Secondly, to try to start to identify the major issues, both the positives and the negatives with what's coming out of FDA. And finally, to identify potential areas where Life Science Alley may want to participate in the Washington scene in terms of trying to influence the process, in terms of filing formal comments or the informal interactions that we've had, the various activities that Shay and Dale have told you about. One thing I just also want to add, Life Science Alley is part of a national coalition working on 510K issues. They're a key player there, and some of what you're going to hear comes from that and meetings that coalition has had with Jeff Shuren and others. Okay, here's what we're going to try to go through, an IOM update. I've identified a number of guidances that I think are important. These keep coming out, folks. all right? And then also a key internal SOP, NTI is notice to industry, okay? And then just try to also warn you about what's coming down the pike according to FDA. Okay, we're going to start with the IOM report. Issued late July of this year. The committee itself was controversial in terms of its makeup and its process. The committee report has been controversial. FDA paid $1.3 million for this. The part of the FDA IOM report that has gotten all the press is the IOM two-pronged conclusion. Number one, that the 510K system does not take safety and effectiveness into account. And secondly, that we should junk the 510K system in its entirety and replace it with something else. What that is, they did not define. I will start by saying I disagree with their first conclusion, that the 510K system does not assess safety and effectiveness. And I can point you, if you want, to a number of statutory provisions, regulatory provisions, FDA statements, internal processes, actual clearances, etc., that all relate to safety and effectiveness. The other reaction to the let's junk the 510K system has been its almost universal rejection. The day the report came out, FDA had a press release, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially saying, we're not going to junk the 510K system. Some key members of the Minnesota delegation the same day came out with a statement saying, we don't think we should junk the 510K system. FDA, and I was talking to Jeff Shern about this, he indicated that he was, quote, surprised, very surprised, by what the report said in terms of junking the 510K system. Other individuals have referred to the report as a, quote, waste, etc. Now, understand, though, that that two-pronged conclusion, not assessing safety and efficacy, let's junk the process, start again, has resonated with a number of other stakeholders. And for example, some key opinion leaders in the medical community, the academic people here, have come out in favor of the IOM report. 3 weeks ago, plus or minus, there were 2 articles in the New England Journal of Medicine. One of those articles was authored by the executive editor of the New England Journal and the editor of the Archives of Internal Medicine, saying the IOM is right and we should junk the system. The executive editor of New England Journal, the editor of JAMA, and other doctors have testified in front of Congress saying the 510K system is not adequate, junk it, start again. So just because we may think this is a silly conclusion doesn't mean there aren't stakeholders out there that will be using this report, and at essentially any congressional hearing on this subject, I anticipate that you will hear people like this citing and quoting the IOM report. So this is alive and well, and we'll tell you how that will play out. Now, everybody kind of ends the discussion right there. I don't think we can. We need to move on. Remember that IOM was asked 2 questions. The second of those questions was the impact of the system on innovation. They declined to answer that question. They said they couldn't figure it out. And their recommendation was, let's create a commission to study the innovation question. I thought that's what they were, but that's a different question. And by the way, I offered to do a study to recommend somebody create a commission for a lot less than $1.3 million. You'll also remember in January of this year, FDA specifically referred 7 so-called contentious issues to IOM. These included things like the Class 2B, rescission authority, those kinds of things. The IOM committee did not address those. They said they had insufficient time to address those 7 questions. So those remain on the table. You and I can debate in a different form whether they had enough time, different question. But it's important to remember that the report did more than just say junk it and we can't figure out innovation, let's study it. They actually had 8 recommendations. And those recommendations do have some life, at least some of them. Here are the 8. Recommendation 1, this was the junk the system, start again. Recommendation 2, these are quotes. FDA should develop and implement, et cetera, a comprehensive medical device post-market performance system. What that means is post-market surveillance, post-market controls, et cetera. So IOM is out there saying we need significantly enhanced post-market surveillance activities, processes, requirements, et cetera. Related to that is their third conclusion, that they need to review their post-market regulatory authorities to identify and address limitations. There's not a lot of detail behind these, okay? The actual report, how many, by the way, out of curiosity, how many people have actually read the entire report? All right, some fellow nerds. There's not a lot of detail behind these recommendations. So I can't tell you IOM said the post-market surveillance system should explicitly have A, B, and C. It's not there. But these recommendations will be used to support enhanced post-market surveillance and post-market authorities. What type of post-market authority could we be thinking about here? This could be things like rescission. That would fit into this category. Fourth recommendation is that FDA should consider a modified de novo process as a mechanism for assessing safety and effectiveness of Class II devices. I start with a comment that the de novo process is not an approval or clearance process. It's a classification process, right? I do de novo to see whether I'm a PMA or a 510K. The IOM committee either didn't understand that, or they're thinking that process could be grafted in between the 510K and the PMA process, kind of like a PMA light. This, as you see, also links into the Class 2B discussion because that could be a mechanism for a Class 2B type approach. Am I clear what I'm trying to say here? By the way, folks, this should be interactive. Questions, comments, whatever, pipe up, okay? The next four. Continuous quality improvement within FDA. This is essentially trying to put quality system concepts within FDA, and you see some of this will be coming to pass. Recommendation 6, this was the commission to study innovation. By the way, are people familiar with the Entrepreneur in Residence program that FDA will be announcing shortly? They're doing two things. They're creating two teams, one a tactical team of external people who will be boots on the ground at FDA working on a specific project in the PMA space, trying to develop better innovative processes, and second, a strategic or vision committee that will be announced sometime in the next week or two that will try to look at the broad issue of innovation at FDA. I don't know committee membership at this point in time. The last I knew, which was 2 days ago, they had not decided on committee membership. Now, what else did IOM say? We're worried about software. Specific concern about software. And this will come back when we talk about the modification guidance. And 8, this has been around since 1990. Those, pre-amendment devices that never got classified, those need to be cleared out. And I think everybody agrees with 8. That process is actually underway. Just this summer, they announced 3 or 4 reclassifications. I don't think anything surprising in those. Others may disagree. Their schedule there is to have that process done by 2012. As I commented once, we wrote the Constitution in a lot less time than it takes us to reclassify a device. That did not go over well with the people at FDA I was talking to. But it's true. And then this is one of those classics. It's been around. It's been a job they were supposed to have done back in the 90s, and they just haven't gotten it done, and now they're getting hammered for it. Those are the recommendations. So you see it's a lot more than just junk, the 510K. My view, at least 5 out of 8 are going to trigger some action at FDA. There's going to be a September 16th public meeting on the 510K IOM report. When I put this together on Monday, I thought it was an open question whether the issues about the committee composition should be addressed at this meeting. As you may know, I've written a couple of articles contending that FDA is statutorily prohibited from using it. Bob Klipinski's been part of a group that's submitted a citizen's petition taking that same position. I got an email back yesterday from FDA saying that the issue of committee composition and FDA's ability to use the IOM report will not be a topic for the September 16th meeting. Seems to me you need to figure out whether you can use it before you talk about it, but that's just me. So that's the September 16th meeting. Yes, Bob?
The Washington Legal Foundation, who I filed a petition to, is appearing there and submitting comments. So they're going to try to force some document to their appearing, but I expect FDA to brush them off.
I think it'll be one of those 5-minute spiels when people stand up at the mic. But anyways, that's going to be September 16th. Written comments on the IOM report are due September 30th. By the end of October, Jeff Shuren has said FDA will publish its written response and reaction to the IOM report. They will also announce around that same time, I don't know if it'll be the same document or not, how they plan to proceed with the 7 contentious issues. I don't know if they're going to address all of them, what it's going to be, but that will be when they lay out their pathway on those 7 other issues, the Class 2B, the rescission, etc., which ones they're going to address and how they're going to do it. So that's the schedule going forward. Now, what does this mean? How does this fit into what's going on out there? A couple of thoughts. First of all, the IOM recommendation to junk the 510K system gives FDA cover to make a lot of significant changes in the system. Because now whatever they do that doesn't completely dismember the 510K system can be postured as a compromise. Right? We're not as radical as the IOM committee. You know, we are more moderate than that. So this gives them political cover. And when they're up in front of Congress, they're being beaten on, they will say, but we didn't go as far as IOM. The other recommendations, post-market surveillance, software, etc., that will support enhanced regulation. And they will cite that in various contexts to support that additional regulation. The report also supplies ammunition for critics of industry and critics of FDA. That's just a fact. You've already seen it in the New England Journal of Medicine articles. You've seen it in congressional testimony. One thing that I have been surprised by is there really hasn't been a coherent analytical response by industry to the report. AdvaMed, others have come out with press releases. But I mentioned earlier that IOM concluded that the 510K system does not consider safety and effectiveness. I have not seen an analyzed a document that analyzes that and responds to it. I'm hoping that people do that in the written comments and in the public meeting, but that I think is something right now that is lacking. Questions on the IOM report? Yes, sir. There are 2 thoughts I'll give you. One is I don't know because I haven't seen what FDA is going to do. Second thing is my prediction is that we will not see a lessening in pre-market. We will actually see an increase in pre-market requirements and an increase in post-market. That would be my guess, particularly for higher-end 510K products. Whether FDA does a formal Class 2B or not, I think I think the guidance documents will go through support an increasing level of requirement of pre-market and post-market. But until we see the results of all of this, that's my opinion, and we're exactly what you're saying. Okay. Pending guidances. There are a lot of them, folks. There's just a lot. And start off with a caution. All right? These are draft. These have not gone through the public process completely yet. We have no preambles to help us interpret these, which you normally have once everything's finalized. We have no history with these, no precedent. These are hot off the presses. So what you're getting are just my this. And I will tell you, I've read these a number of times. Each time I read them, I see something else. So my thoughts here are just that. They're preliminary, and there are issues, there are interconnections that I haven't sorted out yet, that hopefully all of you are in the process of also trying to sort out. The first one we're going to talk about is, I think, a biggie. And this is the device modification guidance. Came out July 27th. Comments are due October 25th. This replaces the 1997 modifications guidance. Now, I will tell you that FDA is saying informally that this guidance simply documents their current practices, that there's nothing new here. And there, I think, is probably a disconnect between how a number of people in the industry have viewed the modification submission requirements and what FDA is saying they should be. And one of the challenges here, both in the narrow realm of commenting, but also in reacting to these, if they come about these ways, is how to bridge that gap between how industry, and at least a number of people in industry, have been proceeding with what FDA's expectations are. Stated differently, somebody stands up and says, under the new guidance, we would have to submit modification for X. FDA said, wait, you should have been doing that all along. Right? So there's a bit of a challenge here to this. Remember the statutory and regulatory requirements we are trying to implement here. You submit something that could significantly affect safety or effectiveness. Remember, that is different than the PMA test, which is could affect. Right? We add the word significantly in there. And remember, there is pressure on FDA to regulate more modifications, to review more of them. The IOM report, congressional pressures, physicians, etc., are all in this. And there have been some high visibility enforcement actions and recalls arguably related to this that help fuel the perceived need to have greater oversight of modifications. Now, I want you, as you think about this, remember the linkage to your other processes, memo to file, letter to file, whatever you happen to call it, and documenting why changes need not be submitted. As we go through this, I'm going to try to identify at least what I think are a couple of potential pitfalls in how you document your answer may actually put you into a requirement to submit. All right? And I'll point out a couple of those we go through. And they go through a variety of types of changes here, from manufacturers, etc., software, suppliers, whatever. As you think about your supplier control programs, remember that the modification requirements don't end at your doors. If you have a supplier, if they make modifications, you have that same obligation. So your supplier control systems have to be linked into this as well. Whether by contract provisions, by inspections, audits, however you do it. Remember that linkage with your supplier controls. Okay, they set forth a couple of key concepts. And the first is that any change intended to improve device safety or effectiveness must be submitted. Any change. Now, first, remember this links into your CAPA system, your recalls, notification, etc. systems. And think about your linkage to your CAPA. When is an improvement to a performance aspect something that addresses safety or effectiveness? Right. Now, note that this is an improvement, not necessarily responding to a field problem, but if I'm just increasing effectiveness, it may well be submitted, required to be submitted. Understand, as part of that, FDA has a concern over what I call stealth recalls, where I've got a problem, I'll change it, I won't do a recall, I won't submit it, I'll just kind of fix it. Then I'll just, start shipping, version A1 instead of version, A. FDA considers that a stealth recall. Part of this is to really come down on those kinds of stealth recalls. Now, what about a change that is a performance improvement change? When does that meet the test of improving device safety or effectiveness? Note that effectiveness is equally part of this equation. It's not just safety. Okay? So this, I think, is an interesting question that I don't have an answer to right now. Obviously, this is a very broad test. How this links into all the statutory requirements, I think, is an open question that I haven't completely thought through. I'm still thinking about it. Next, for you, Dale. The agency makes it difficult to what I call test out of the requirement to submit. And this is a quote. In most cases, testing cannot conclusively show that a change could not affect safety or effectiveness. Written by a lawyer, right? Now, what does this really mean? Well, first, are we switching a burden of proof here from I have to show that it could affect to I have to prove it couldn't affect? That's an important semantic shift. Secondly, testing here refers to non-clinical testing. Bench testing, computer simulations, modeling, all the stuff people like Dale know 100 times better than I do. Right? Now, what this also means is if I can theoretically test this via bench testing, computer simulation, whatever, in most cases that's not going to be enough, right? I'm going to need to have clinical information. So this is important for when you need to submit, but it's also important for your documentation if you're deciding not to submit. You see here in part a continual push towards clinical data being the basis for the decision whether to submit and then also the submission. First of all, FDA hates the flowchart in the 97 document, okay? And they do not have flowcharts. They're not planning on having flowcharts in any of the new ones. Their view is that people have relied too much on the flowchart and ignored the words. Okay, that's point one. Point two, is this a change from the 97 guidance? I think it is. Okay. My opinion's, you know, FDA really doesn't care about it. Right. All right, remember as part of this, if there are product-specific guidance documents, those have to be followed in addition to this. Essentially, any change to your intended use needs to be submitted. Changes to your indications for use will usually need to be submitted. They say that most changes to indications for use are major changes and therefore need to be submitted to the agency. As you think about that, think about the interaction with the general specific claims guidance and think about tool-type indications, right? Where it's not a therapy, it's a tool the physician uses to deliver a therapy. Because I think that links in with your indications for use as well. We will come back to this theme, by the way, when we get into things like off-label use. Now, obviously when you're asking the question, could this change significantly affect, you have to have something you are comparing it to, right? And what it is the most recently cleared device, not the most recent iteration of the device. There's an FDA concern over device creep, where I make a lot of little changes that causes a problem. There's an FDA concern over tolerance stack-up type problem. Those are kind of my terminology. As you think about this for your things, you've got to assess your internal procedures, decision trees, whatever is there. This may trigger the need for what I call make-up 510Ks. Right? Secondly, and I think this is important, that's why I put it in red, your comparison is to a single 510K. You can't say, well, I know from 510K-A and 510K-B that this will not have any effect. You can't do that under this draft guidance. It is a one-to-one comparison. Whatever the 510K is, you look at that 510K and only that 510K. The example they use, device A uses biomaterial A. Device B uses biomaterial B. I want to change device A to use biomaterial B. I cannot and should not look at the 510K for device B. All right? So this narrows your basis for comparison. As you think about combining or linking devices, I'm taking a bunch of parts of a kit and I'm putting them together, or I'm doing some interconnectivity, this becomes very problematic. All right? And you don't compare it to a device that you could use as a predicate. It is to an existing 510K. So as you think about your processes, you've got to make sure you've got the right comparator under this draft guidance. If you're making more than one change, or you have made more than one change, you have to each time assess each change you have made since the last 510K and assess those individually. You also then have to assess them in combination. Okay? And this is back to your last 510K, not since your last change. And by the way, this should be obvious, all your QSR stuff still applies here. Now, I think good process in the past, you're doing this anyways. If any one change triggers a 510K, your submission needs to include all changes since the last 510K, even if those changes do not meet the test of could significantly affect safety or effectiveness. So you may have made a dozen cosmetic changes, right? And which have nothing to do with it. You change the color of whatever. And then you make a change that does trigger it. You submit all 13. Now what this means is the size, the scope, the time, the effort for each of those 510Ks obviously becomes much larger. But your processes in place have to address this. All right? Which I think is also an important point that all of us need to consider. But they then got more specific and got into manufacturing. If you had process manufacturing type information in your original 510K, and you're making a manufacturing process change, then FDA says it's much more likely that your manufacturing change is something that could significantly affect. Now, what does this mean for regulatory strategy? To the extent you can, do you want to put manufacturing stuff in your 510K? Because once it's there, you're kind of stuck with it. Most packaging changes do not need a 510K. However, there's an exception to that, and that is if the methods or protocols you use to assess your packaging change, then you probably need a submission. Okay? Many sterility changes will need to be submitted. Some minor ones you don't need to if you're just tweaking things, and your sterility assurance level remains where it was. As I read this document, if you change sterility method, even if it's the one that's been established for 50 years, you submit. That's how I read this, right? Now, obviously, if you're changing from sterile to non-sterile, a change makes sense. A submission makes sense. They also, though, want you to make a submission if you're going from non-sterile to sterile, okay? Just so you know. Labeling. As I mentioned, almost all changes to indications for use need to be submitted. Taking an indication for use or an intended use off your label for pure marketing reasons does not require a submission. There is no longer a market for my widgets for use in X. Right? No one's buying it because one of you's come up with a better technology. So I'm taking it off because I'm not selling it. If it's purely marketing, no submission. However, if there are any non-marketing reasons, you have to submit the fact that you're deleting the intended use or the indication for use. And here is where, in an inspection, they'll look at your CAPA documents, look at a variety of things, trying to see if there's a linkage. Or if somebody once said, boy, we have a problem with X, or here's an adverse event with Y. They also identify a number of labeling changes that generally need a 510K. Some of these are pretty obvious, going from single use to reusable, down classifying from prescription to OTC, etc. The ones that get more interesting are the ones when it's prescription, but prescription for use in a clinic to prescription in a non-clinic setting. Home use, ambulance, emergency room, those kinds of things, right? So think about that as you think through your labeling. And remember, there is a general trend to moving medical technology down the value chain for obviously cost reasons as well as patient benefit. We save money if we can do it, you know, in an outpatient rather than inpatient. That may require a submission, okay? Changes from a general patient population to a specific patient population will probably need to be submitted. Think about this in terms of the general specific claim. Any new or modified contraindication needs to be submitted. They are linking this, by the way, to recall issues as well. There's a question that you have to think through about whether you can continue to ship if you think you need to add a contraindication. There's another interesting twist they throw out here, and this is in a footnote. I had a rule in law school that if it was in a footnote, it obviously wasn't that important, so I wouldn't read it. Right? You got to read these footnotes. Most of you may recognize that the PMA process has a changes being affected provision, right? There is no such analog in the 510K world. They are trying to graft one on, right? Adding a contraindication requires a submission, correct? Can I market, distribute, sell my product until that 510K has been cleared? No, it's adulterated and misbranded, correct? What they're saying here is they want to encourage people to make these changes quickly, so while they explicitly recognize in a footnote that adding the contraindication renders the product adulterated and misbranded, they will exercise enforcement discretion and not bring an enforcement action against you for sales with that uncleared additional or modified contraindication. Right? That's enforcement discretion, it's not binding. Note that you may have other compliance risks, False Claims Act, for example. You may have contract provisions with purchasers in which you warrant that your product is not adulterated and misbranded, all of those kinds of things. So you got to think about these linkages, folks. So part of it is how much do you want to rely upon enforcement discretion, and what sort of risks do you have under these other both enforcement provisions like False Claims Act and under contract or other provisions with purchasers or whomever. If you are deleting a contraindication, that requires a submission, and none of this enforcement discretion stuff applies. Now, back to the changes being affected, this also could link into preemption, because if you look at some of the case law of the Supreme Court, the existence of a changes being affected provision is used to defeat preemption. There is generally not preemption in 510K. There are some exceptions to that. So your product liability people need to think about this as well. Okay. The next one I think is a bit fuzzy. All right? If you're instructing the user to use the device in a different fashion, that needs a submission. And that's going to be a gray line, right? What that exactly is. The example they give, adding information about how to interpret diagnostic information. Is that instructing them to use it in a different fashion, or is that giving more information for what it means, what the information already means? Adding information to a cutting instrument about incision procedures is another example. They give something that would trigger a submission because it is instructing you to use the product in a different fashion. What about a new warning? And they differentiate warnings and contraindications. If you're adding a new warning, they say talk to FDA. If you're deleting a warning, you got to do a submission with this. Technology. If you're making a change in technology, it needs a submission. They give a couple of examples. Just because you're moving to an already proven technology does not eliminate this requirement. In part, remember, you can only look at one 510K. This links into that. If you're modifying key components, changes in energy types are all things that require submissions. A change in specifications. The two examples they give, if I'm making a catheter more kink resistant, that requires a submission. I've got an oximeter, I'm taking the detection level from 90% oxygen levels down to 70. I need to do a submission. Ergonomic changes also gets dicey. Right? If it's pure comfort stuff or aesthetics, that's one thing. But if it's anything else, it requires a submission. And they give an interesting example. I've got a powered surgical tool, cutter, whatever it happens to be, and I'm moving the location of the motor to give it just better balance and better feel. That requires a submission. Why? Because if you're moving it closer to the patient, there may be a burn risk. So you say, I don't have to do a submission, I'm moving it farther away from the patient. Then you may have a burn risk to the user. Okay? That's the example they give, folks. I don't make this up. I'm just the messenger, all right? So ergonomic changes, I think, are going to be another gray area. Literally, if it's pure comfort stuff, you know, that's one thing. But I think their example is a pretty interesting one. Changes in user interfaces. A number of those do need to be submitted, both on the material and also in the human factor engineering area. If you're making a display bigger, that may be one thing. If you're making the display smaller, that may require a submission. Look at user interfaces often on a case-by-case basis. So this user interface is going to be complex. Think about the human factors guidance that's out there as well. I have not thought through all of those linkages, folks, but they're there. Dimensional specification changes, they often will require a change. The example they give of one that doesn't is if I have a bone plate that I have 2 millimeter and 4 millimeter thickness approvals, I can make a 3, right? Because that's within that range that's there. If I'm making a stent longer, I need to do a submission.
Ralph?
Yes?
So this just seems to come down to what FDA determines is significant or not, right? Depending upon the device.
Yes.
So it's in the eye of the beholder.
And you will be judged, in a sense, after the fact. Did I ever tell you life was fair? I don't think I did. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the challenges here. And how, I mean, listen, in real life, the scenario that worries you is you've got a product out there and a problem develops, right? It gets some publicity, FDA comes in for an inspection, and they will go back through all of these, you fear, with 20/20 hindsight, saying, why didn't you submit? And by the way, even if the submission, if that modification isn't the direct cause of the problem, if you didn't submit, and you should have, and something else caused the problem, you still have an adulterated, misbranded product that it was illegal for you to ship. And you see a number of enforcement actions where they go after a company for failure to submit a change, PMA or 510K, when the actual change isn't the cause of the field problem. Okay? But the linkage is because that submission was not submitted, that change was not submitted when it should have been, the product was adulterated and misbranded, it is therefore illegal to ship, and so just because something else caused the problem, the product should never have been out there. Understand the logic chain. Am I making sense? Okay.
Well,
Yes.
I mean, in effect, this more conservative posture by FDA at 510K is making it more PMA-like. I mean, one example is in like your 30-day notice changes, making some subtle changes in your manufacturing operation, you're probably running, if you're a big company, Class 3 and Class 2 product through that same manufacturing line, so that might trigger the need for a 510K.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. Software. FDA struggles with software. I mean, we were at a meeting with Jeff Shuren, and he specifically said to this National 510 Coalition, I need help with software. Right? They're really struggling with how to do this. Their concern is the unanticipated impact of a small change here on something, you know, some other place. Obviously, a software change relating to patient or therapy should get serious consideration for a submission. If you're changing something like, you know, how the printer works or a general alarm, it's disconnected, that probably does not. Almost any change in data transmission, receipt, whatever, requires a change. Remote controls require a change. Going to anything that's autonomous or semi-autonomous requires a change. If you're making a change to address an error, that requires a submission. Right? That's software, and obviously this is an area that they are struggling with. Off-label use. I think this is important. If you make a change that would impact possible off-label use, even if that's not your intent, it requires a change. The quote, a modification that could create a reasonable likelihood of off-label use requires a submission. What this requires you to do, therefore, is anticipate and understand how your customers may use your product, even if that's not what you want them to do. Your intent is not relevant. They give an example. Surgical scissors. I'm lengthening my surgical scissors, perhaps because it's more convenient, it's better ergonomics, whatever, right? Well, now it may be long enough that I can use it in some sort of endoscopic procedure. That's not my labeling, that's not my intent, I don't market it that way, I don't promote it that way, etc. But because it now could be used in that closed procedure, off-label, I need to do a submission. So you need to understand those kinds of things. A change that allows, even if it's not your intended use, not your labeling, a new expanded or more specific patient population may require a submission. A dimensional change that allows pediatric use is an example. So you need to think about all of these. I saw nothing that required actual knowledge of a use. We will come to that when we get to the RUO guidance as well, okay? Okay, we got a lot of stuff still to go. Modification that could alter an established medical procedure. Again, this is fuzzy, this is gray, requires it. Use in a new environment, clinic to ambulance, to home, whatever. Reducing the number of EEG leads so it may be used in an emergency setting. May not be your intent, but that requires a submission as well. Materials. Changes to materials that directly or indirectly contact patients require a change. An indirect contact is contact with something, a fluid or a gas, for example, that then contacts the patient. Changes in material formulations require a 510K. You're changing polymers. This is something the agency continues to struggle with. Changes in surface preparation or surface itself. How you prepare it, that requires a change. This links back, by the way, into the CenterPoint hip problem of the early 2000s. Use of clinical data. If you need clinical data to assess the change because bench testing or simulations are not sufficient, then you probably need a 510K. Let me stop right here. I want you to think through the linkage between where I started, you generally can't test out of the submission, to this statement, if you got to look at clinical data, you probably got to do a submission. You see how those link? I can rarely use testing, so I got to look at clinical data. If I've got to look at clinical data, I got to do a submission. Understand how this fits? I think this is important. All right? Obviously, this impacts how one uses modeling. This gives you a disincentive, paradoxically, to think about clinical data and think about your documentation. Right? You're making a change. You have all this wonderful bench testing. Your engineers, being engineers, say, we've also looked at the clinical stuff. And it supports it, right? What have I just done? Oh, you needed to look at clinical data. You should have done a submission. I want you to understand these linkages. Am I making sense here? Okay. The summary of this one, the devil's in the detail. There's a lot of stuff in here, folks, that I'm still trying to think through, and hopefully all of you are too. It's unclear what impact this will have on numbers of submissions. I have heard estimates from various industry groups of between 30% and 200%. Will you still make the same changes that you made before? And we've talked about enforcement risks. Okay, we're going to move on. How many people here have even thought about the RUO, IUO guidance out of the diagnostic world? I'm not a diagnostic company, you say. Who cares? Right? There's an issue here I want to bring to your attention that a position they're taking that if it's used broader has, I think, tremendous implications. Just, in the diagnostic world, an RUO, research use only, is, a test that a, researcher at the University of Minnesota is using in his or her lab without a human being within miles. And you label it research use only, you ship it to them. Life is good, right? And this is to address that. What they say here is the objective intent of the company, which is a critical legal aspect, right, is based upon the company's knowledge of off-label use. And that the company should not sell to a customer if the company has, quote, reason to know that the product has been used or could be used in an off-label fashion. So what we're doing here, arguably, is going from objective intent of the manufacturer to a situation in which your regulatory status is controlled by how your customers use your product. That's why I think you need to pay attention to this guidance. This, I think, is potentially a major change, right? Because you lose control over your regulatory status, and they're explicitly saying you shouldn't sell. Okay? Now, historically, there's a lot of law here that we can bore you with. The objective intent is the manufacturers. There's Supreme Court language on this. And the uses, statements, etc. of third parties are not attributed to you unless you planted it or did something else, right? So you have Dr. Jones at St. Ralph's Hospital publishes an article, you had nothing to do with it, saying, look what we're doing with this product, isn't it great? Can you continue to sell to that hospital? That's the issue this is raising, okay? Example. Hospital uses 5% of product off-label. Can you still sell? The product's approved for a general population. You get an order from a pediatric physician. Can you sell, or do you now have reason to know of off-label? So these are things I just want to point out to you in this RUO guidance that most of you probably ignored when it came out, right? Because I'm not a diagnostic company. They have not explicitly taken this yet to the therapeutic side of devices. But if this reasoning applies in the diagnostic side, I can think of no reason why it would not apply in the therapeutic side. Another one, chemical action. You all know that the definition of a drug versus a device is that drugs work via chemical action, right? How many of you ever paid attention to what the definition of chemical action is? Because it's not been defined up until this point in time. Right? And there have been some strange decisions out there, a mouthwash called Decapanol as a device, etc. They came out with a guidance, comments due September 19th, and this is how they define chemical action. Chemical reaction, intermolecular force that mediates a body response at the cellular molecular level or combines with or modifies an entity in a way that affects that entity's interaction with the body. And right now you're all bored. Right? You say, who cares? I took chemistry in high school. and never since. And a chemical reaction is the formation or breaking of covalent or ionic bonds. By the way, I took high school chemistry in 1969. I got an A in it. I have never touched chemistry since. All right, I'm very proud of that. So please do not ask me the detailed physics behind all of this, okay? Intermolecular forces, blah, 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 okay? Why do I care? Well, think about it. Whoops. This definition can push some historic devices into the drug world. For example, electrical pulses, pacemaker pulses, form and break molecular bonds. They open and close ionic channels in the cell wall. That's how they work. Heat breaks molecular bonds, doesn't it? Look how we define chemical action. It includes breaking chemical bonds. Cold can modify a biological activity due to decreased molecular atomic activity. Radiation, dilution. They view dilution as a chemical action. So for many of your products that are the standard mechanical, a crutch, right, a screw, right, this doesn't really apply that much. But when you get into some new technologies, you can see how understanding what chemical action is becomes quite important. So I just point that out to you. Yeah. This pops up two places, okay? First of all, the definition of chemical action is used to decide whether the components of that product meet the definition of a combination product, right? To be a combination product, I have to have one that's a device and one that's a drug or a biologic, okay? And I use this definition to see which category I'm in. Once I'm in that, then it's used to determine primary mode of action for classification under the combination product regs. So it pops up a couple of places, but it's important not just in the standalone drug device, but also in combo products. I don't think they will, this is my personal opinion, I don't think they're going to go back and now classify pacemakers as drugs. I don't. But as you think about new therapies, how many of you playing around are interested in nanotechnology? Nano, is that chemical or is that physical? I've actually written a paper on that if you ever suffer insomnia. Okay, we can cure that. So I point this out to you as just something to keep an eye on. This links into the device classification guidance. Comments on this are due the 19th. They really cover three things: the classification process, factors in determining classification, and the status of inter-center agreements and prior classifications. In terms of the process, this is that request for designation stuff, etc. I'm not going to go through this. Here are the details. I don't think there are major changes in this. I mean, some stuff around the edges and process, but if you're into the combo product, pay attention to this. This is the second thing they address, which is the classification question. They assert that drug is a broader term than device. That's an interesting statutory debate, but that's a different thing. They also say two things which may or may not be paradoxical. First, if the product meets both a drug and device definition, they will probably regulate as a device. Very interesting, I think. Secondly, if there's uncertainty about the device classification, they'll default back to drug. I don't know how those are going to interact, folks. I wish I did. But I point this out to you, whether it's in a combination product context or new technology or whatever. If chemical action contributes, even in part, to the therapeutic action, then the primary mode of action is chemical, both for initial classification and also for combination product purposes. Now, a lot of products are unaffected by this. New technologies, nano, synthetic biology, etc., could well be affected by this. Now, what do you do about prior classifications? FDA says they are not bound by prior classifications except as set forth in this guidance. And you wanted predictability and a level playing field, okay? If the classification is regulation-based, they're stuck. If it's clearly within that regulatory classification. They can add special controls, labeling requirements, all sorts of things, but they're probably stuck, and there they have to seek to change the regulation. If it's not a regulation-based classification, let's say it's an RFD, as an example, and they don't like the prior answer, they are not bound by it, and they are proposing a very interesting and I think bizarre process. So 5 years ago, you got your widget classified as a device, class 2, and I'm coming in with mine. I say, they got theirs, I want mine. Same thing. They say, not so fast. So I submit my request for designation, or whatever the format is. What they're going to do is simply not decide the RFD. Interesting. They will deliberately not decide it. Now, under the statute, your proposed designation becomes de facto what it is, but they will then start a reclassification process and will use enforcement discretion as to whether to go on against people. This is quite unclear to me, all right? But I just point this out to you that the level of certainty you may want in prior classifications is now going to depend upon whether it's regulation-based classification or non-regulation-based. And just because for 20 years it's always been a 510K whatever, right, doesn't mean it will be in the future. Okay, risk-benefit guidance. Issued August 15th, comments due the 14th. These are the factors the FDA says they will consider when making basically PMA 510K types of decisions. There are a lot of statutory provisions, regulatory provisions we link in here. There is a proposed reviewer workshop. I recommend you pay attention to that. I think it's pretty interesting. The kinds of things they're talking about for effectiveness with intended use. Now stop here and remember the linkage to off-label and how off-label I may need to label for it. I may need a submission for it. Intended use, right, has to now take into account potentially those kinds of things. But what they're looking at are type of benefit, magnitude, probability, duration of benefit, the safety measures, number, severity, types, procedure-related, direct and indirect harms, probability of harm, duration of harm, etc. Additional factors they look at: the certainty of the risk, certainty of the benefit, disease characterization, patient tolerance for risk, available alternative therapies, risk mitigation opportunities, novelty of therapy. I will concentrate here on two: patient tolerance for risk and available alternative therapies. Are those FDA questions or are those practice of medicine questions? Patient tolerance for risk is variable. You and I have very different risk profiles, right? And the example I use, if I get diagnosed today with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, my risk tolerance will vary tremendously depending not only on the disease type, but the status of my life. Let's assume I have my first grandchild to be born in 6 months. I may take a lot more risk to try to be alive for that, right? Or otherwise, I may take the round-the-world tour, live at the champagne bar and hope I drop dead when the cruise ship docks, right? So it's very individual here. And historically, patient tolerance for risk has been a practice of medicine question between the patient and the physician. The other thing here is alternative available therapies. What is this a code word for? Comparative effectiveness. If you look at the legislative history of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, going back to 1962, FDA was explicit in congressional testimony that they would not compare two therapies. They would not compare two products. Black and white legislative history. If you ever get really tired and bored and suffer insomnia, I can show that to you. We're getting here into comparative effectiveness in an indirect fashion. I just point that out to you. Now, they give a number of examples. An implantable diagnostic will reduce hospital stay by 1 day. That has a negative risk-benefit ratio, they believe. Permanently implantable birth control device. There was only a 2-year follow-up. Not enough to really understand the risks. There are other safe and effective alternatives. So these are just examples that are out there. The risk benefit, like a lot of these, has some positives and negatives. Positives for industry, you get increased clarity. You know what they're looking at. And you can help design your clinical trials or whatever, your submissions, to address what they've told you they're looking at. The potential negatives here, involvement in practice of medicine, patient risk-benefit decisions, comparative effectiveness. They also are very explicit. Just because you had a positive risk-benefit 5 years ago does not mean you have a positive risk-benefit today. There are a couple of reasons for that they give. One is we may know a lot more about risks. That's legit. The other is new therapies have come on. So you see how, again, this is fitting in with comparative effectiveness as well. Yeah. I mean, you know, this is not my grandmother's 510K system. Okay? I mean, I think it's clear that over the past few years, we have seen and are seeing potentially some significant changes. And these are just examples of that. It will be European potentially in the comparative effectiveness, but not in either third-party roles or looking at it from a technology base as compared from a clinical base. Okay, we're moving on because I'm running short of time. I told you there was a lot. Mobile medical applications, here comments are due the 19th. There is a public workshop the 12th and the 13th if you're interested. That workshop will be webcast. The topics they're talking about are standalone mobile medical applications as accessories, and decision support software. Remember, this links into the MDDS regs as well. The 1989 draft software guidance was withdrawn in 2005, the world's longest running draft guidance. We've mentioned the uncertainty over software. This guidance is primarily a definitional guidance. Are you a medical device or not if you're a mobile medical app? Here is the definition. They see a lot of MMAs as accessories to devices. Right? Notice that the manufacturer here includes anyone who creates, develops labels, et cetera, a software system, including from commercially available software, or provides MMA functionality through web support or service, or initiates specs or requirements for an MMA, or actually creates it. Pretty broad definition there of a manufacturer. This excludes electronic health records, as well as some other materials there. These are examples they give. I'm not going to go through these. It's pretty large. Some of these are pretty clear, like remote display of data from bedside manners. Where you're going to see challenges are people doing the one-off, convenience-based apps for their, the iPad or the iPhone or whatever, right? And this is going to be a control challenge for a lot of you, and it's going to pull, the software, guy out in Silicon Valley who just thinks he's having fun making an app into FDA's web. The regulatory classification will vary. If it is a device, then it takes and it's an accessory to a device, it takes the classification of the parent. Okay? So if the parent's a PMA, this app is a PMA. Remember, all your standard device regs apply. This gets into software validation, verification. Your risk here is an inadvertent creation of an MMA and the one-off app developers. Good point by Bob. He's absolutely correct. This is the inadvertent. I never knew I was an FDA-regulated company. Okay, I'm going to breeze through the last couple here and leave 5 minutes for questions. Clinical trials guidance came out. Comments due November 14th. There are kind of 3 stages in their minds: feasibility, pivotal, post-market. This deals with pivotal, right? All types of both SR and NSR studies they think should be regulated by this. They remind us that clinical data is needed for almost all original PMAs. The things they want you to consider in your trial design: population diversity, variable device performance, availability of alternative therapies. CE comes back in it here. They also want to know how and why the device works, not just that it works. A lot of human factor stuff is popping up here. This links into the risk-benefit draft guidance because this is where you need to create the data to support the factors they're looking at in risk-benefit. They do mention least burdensome here as something they take into account, and they also talk just about the concept of feasibility studies. They recognize there are lots of different kinds of clinical trials, randomized, controlled, non-controlled, historical controls, et cetera, right? The guidance has a preference for randomized clinical studies over other types, and they favor clinical data over non-clinical. The medical profession, by the way, is firmly on board this. You talk to the Rita Redbergs of the world. She wants double-blind, placebo-controlled studies on everything. I've debated her about this, and I can't get through. Probably my fault. Subject selection, just talk about a couple of things. Obviously, age, gender, race, ethnicity considerations, at least. It may be broader. Disease prevalence and course. What's the course of this disease? Where are we applying this therapy? Early, mid, late. Stratified selection, inclusion, exclusion criteria as ways to get people in. Considerations of pediatric and other special populations. The endpoints, this has to be linked to your intended use and the risk-benefit factors. They have to be specific, meaningful, and objective. They get very nervous over composite, surrogate, or subject-reported endpoints, and they've got a lot of concerns over after-the-fact data mining. The highlights here are randomized studies of some type are strongly encouraged, concurrent controls are strongly preferred, and they get nervous over non-comparative or observational studies. Next, 522 studies. Remember, this is for class 2 or 3 products if the product is a serious potential health risk, is used in a pediatric population, implantable for more than a year, or is life-sustaining outside of a user facility. Now, you don't have to have one if you're in that category. You are eligible for one. There's a lot of pressure on FDA to increase the number of 522 studies and to increase their level of oversight and enforcement of 522 studies. They have been blistered, and frankly, industry bears some of this responsibility, folks, where companies will agree to do a 522 study and never do it. And 5 years later, somebody figures out, wait a minute, Widgets R Us said they'd do it and they didn't do it. And that, that's what's one of the things that's driving this. They now have a very elaborate process. The issues identified by the review team, it's referred to a CDRH 522 team. That then creates a cross-center pre-522 team. They go through identification of issue need, public health needs, et cetera, et cetera. This then is the source of the 522 order. It may go through the Center Science Council, Bill Mazel's operation. It's then part of the approval process. 522 studies can range across the board from randomized studies to bench testing to data collection to post-market surveillance, a broad array of things. They're going to track these and make these public. Why? Because many people in the industry weren't doing what they said they were going to do. Reports will be assessed by OSB. Based upon the study results, FDA can request labeling changes. They can request more 522 studies. They can institute more regulatory actions, whatever. The public will have access to 522 studies and results subject to trade secret, patient confidentiality types of protections. Monday, evening, I thought I was done with this, right? A new guidance comes out, clinical investigator monitoring. I'm going to cover this very briefly because I've only read it twice and I missed stuff. Comments are due the 28th. Purpose here is human subject protection, data quality, and general enforcement. Monitoring is oversight. They are interesting saying, people misunderstand. We're not saying you got to do 100% validation of every data site. You got to have a system in place. They reference ICH E8 as another source here if you're interested. They encourage centralized monitoring over on-site monitoring as the only source. They like both. They want you to identify critical monitoring points, review policies, procedures, processes, not just actual data and implementation. This is a more systems view. When I audit, I don't just go and look at the CRFs. I also look at the policies, the procedures, the training, the whatever. So it's a more system approach to clinical trial monitoring. They want a written plan that, among other things, addresses complexity, endpoints, et cetera, okay? And this has to be done in advance of starting the study. Now, last topic. Notice to industry. This is an SOP, not a guidance. Was issued in June. They're still taking input in it. This was part of the work plan. The purpose of this, for FDA's purpose, is to provide consistency in review decisions, minimize their internal process requirements. This is outside of the HHS OMB review process, and they will use the Center Science Council as management tools here, and they're the oversight. This is already in place. It's already being used. They want to use this to communicate faster. This will be used only for submissions. There are 3 criteria. New science has identified new risk or testing. They have a need to modify regulatory expectations, and other alternative mechanisms such as guidance are not appropriate. What's their process? The reviewer comes up with something. It goes to Center Science Council, 1 page. They decide whether to issue it or not. Internal review, sign-off, communication to industry in a variety of mechanisms. There are 2 types of NTIs. There's the NTI that they will treat as immediately in effect guidance, a level 1 guidance. Once they issue it, they will open a docket. You will right now stop and say, but Ralph, you just said one of the triggers was that a guidance system was not adequate. Here they're using guidance systems. I have no response to that other than saying this is what they're saying. The second type is an NTI advisory letter. The advisory letter does not set forth new requirements. It simply identifies to you something that they're worried about. So, for example, in the NTI as a guidance, you should use study A instead of study B, or test methodology A instead of test methodology B, because we don't trust test methodology B anymore. And advisory says, we're not sure we understand test methodology B, and we're thinking about it. We want you thinking about it as well. Doesn't say don't use it. It says we got some questions over it. Here, in this whole NTI, you see a trade-off. Faster communication from FDA, but communication with little or no stakeholder input. And a down regulation, what used to be regs are now guidance. What used to be guidance will become NTIs. Okay, what's coming up? September, generally by the 30th. The 510K paradigm will be reissued. This is critical. This is when you need a 510K. It's the flowchart stuff. All right? De novo proposal is supposed to be out in September. I can't guarantee this is what their plan is, okay? Use of external experts, FDA's internal knowledge management system, third-party review. From talking to FDA, I do not expect this in September, but that's their official schedule, and internal training programs. In October, use of consensus standards, internal appeal process, response to IOM, how they're going to handle the 7 contentious issues. Those are the list of issues. At the end of the year, legislation is going to be proposed by various congressmen and senators beginning probably mid-September. It will go on for the rest of this year. A lot of people, I think, will introduce things. Remember also, we have MEDUFMA reauthorization negotiations underway, and that will be impacting this as well. Okay, conclusion, general observations. There's a heck of a lot going on, folks. Any one of these, we could spend a half a day on the modification guidance, okay? And I just touched the high point. You see, I think, a pattern of increasing regulatory requirements in a number of areas. Increasing use and requirements for clinical data. We're looking a bit more drug-like. The narrowing of 510K eligibility. Increased focus on off-label. And an overall desire for more data, more information, more submissions, and therefore more control. They continue their efforts in transparency. These guidance give FDA a great deal of discretion. You also see increasing CDRH centralization. This is the Center Science Council. I think that's a critical internal control point at FDA. If you have not read their charter, it was issued in July. I suggest you read the charter. It's out there on the website. Okay, that's it, Larry. I surrender.
Thank you, Ralph. You've been a big part of this. You've taken a lead in this for us. And we in the Life Science Alley community, all of us here, really appreciate all the volunteer work. And it is volunteer, and I can point out Mac McKean over here and Bob Klapinski from Frederickson and Byron have given countless hours to us, volunteering their time to inform us. And this is very complex, and I can see that something will come after this as more clarity emerges from this. We'll be doing more programs on this, be much more specific. And also I'd like to have Shay Mandel, our new VP, had a thought here about how this will affect you and your relationships internally. So Shay, if you want to sum things up. If you have program ideas or if you have thoughts at all, please get in touch with me through our info@lifesciencealley.org line or contact me directly. Okay?
Yeah, and actually, I'm not going to take credit for the thought. It was actually, so as Dale sort of squirreled out into another meeting, I mean, he kind of said, geez, I mean, if FDA does exactly what Ralph says they're going to do, we should all just get out of industry today. And of course, then he chuckled and said, you know, these people that manage the regulatory functions within our industry, largely you, really have a difficult job. And, you know, if you know Dale's background, product development, innovation, and he said, you know, my job was always to push the envelope, and so I would meet with our regulatory folks who were always sort of caught between what I wanted to do and what they feared in terms of facing a review team at FDA that might apply the most stringent interpretations. And so one of the things Dale wanted me to ask you, and so send notes to Larry, would it be helpful to put a program together where we brought regulatory folks and product development and business folks together to look at methodologies for building those relationships within your organization in a way to be more helpful? Again, a suggestion from Dale that I ask you to think a little bit about and certainly get back to Larry if there's a programmatic opportunity there that would be helpful for you. The only other thing Dale mentioned, and I just want to reinforce, you know, our rationale for engaging the FDA is really about trying to make the best out of this scenario. So as you hear from Ralph, we don't know how these will all play out. There are worst case scenarios and best case scenarios, and in your experiences in dealing with the FDA, you have both, right? So we can go around the room and have wonderful experiences, and I use that term loosely with the FDA, but also horrific experiences. And so our objective is to engage them to create a definition around regulatory science and the way in which the agency interprets and applies these guidelines to essentially try and shrink that area, to try and sort of eliminate the extremes of experiences and get to a place where industry and the FDA have a more common understanding, and we can expect a more common application of the interpretation of these rules. So that's really what we're engaged in. We want to do so. For those of you, are there questions for Ralph or Larry? Or I?
We are a bit over time, but I'll take a question here. Hold on, please.
Actually, this question is more for Shay. Is Life Science Alley planning on making any comments to all these multiple draft guidances, and are we going to take a lead on putting in industry, at least a, you know, Twin Cities feedback, Minneapolis, Minnesota feedback to all these?
I can be loud. I probably don't. It's the right question, and the answer's yes. That's what I want to do. Now let me just be very honest about where we are today. So as an organization, I'm new to the organization, and so this function of how we might be able to address this, is still in formulation. We have had a working group, Ralph, Mac, and others have been a part of, around some of these 510K issues. And so as I'm setting up what I'll say is the infrastructure for legislative and regulatory engagement, I'm looking to really have a group of regulatory experts, all of you, that are committed to spending a little bit of time as draft guidance comes out or other issues come out from the FDA, to be able to put together small teams to come up with those comments. And I can't do it by myself. You've heard Ralph. I mean, Ralph and I could spend 24/7 for the next 2 months and not get through all of this stuff. So we certainly need your input. And more importantly, you're the experts and want the input. But I think there is value in our organization submitting comments and bringing the power of the 650 companies that are a part of this, but also giving your organization some cover to the extent that you don't want to submit them yourself. So I would ask you, if you're interested in participating in that, if you're willing to commit some time to be a part of a team to help us develop the right comments on the various draft guidance that has come out, I would really appreciate it. And it's something that I would say certainly over the next year as again, we build out really the infrastructure to be able to deliver these services more effectively, we'll be in better shape. Right now, we're kind of getting started, and it's the worst case scenario, right? I just got here. There's a million things coming out, so I need your help. And so we're here to serve, as cover and a gateway for all of you, but need your help to do it.
Let me add one thing to that. Life Science Alley is a member of this National 510K Coalition, and it engages routinely with FDA, and we've had multiple meetings with Jeff Shuren and his senior staff. And what we do there, again, Life Science Alley is part of this, is we put together positions and recommendations that are very specific on a number of these issues. So for example, yesterday we had a conference call on notice to industry and what is going to be the coalition's position back to FDA on the notice to industry. I've got a call tomorrow to start the process of thinking about software. We're starting the process of thinking about device modifications. We submitted specific proposals on de novo, those kinds of things. So Life Science Alley is a key member of that national coalition. So that's another way to get that input.
Okay, wrapping it up, we're 15 minutes over, and I appreciate all of you being here today. Shay will be here, I'll be here, and Ralph will be here to answer specific individual questions you have or comments you have. But please, excellent program today, Ralph. Thank you very much. One more round of applause for Ralph.